So Katie is here to talk to us. I'll say a few things on Katie's behalf, but then I think she'll be better to speak on her own experience. Graduated MIT, majoring in brain and cognitive science, which I think if I could do college again is what I would do, because it's just absolutely the fundamentals of who we are, in my opinion. Not only a Marshall Scholar, but also a PhD candidate at Oxford University, which is also where I would want to go to school if I could do it again. So I'm just jealous all over the board. And a researcher in human facial recognition. Instead of trying to explain what that is, because I clearly don't know, I'm going to hand it off to Katie and let her take it away.
Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction. I feel so fancy now. Hi, I'm Katie. I am the things that David just said, but also I'm here to talk to you about AI, a tiny bit about my own trajectory, because I definitely did not think that I would become an AI person. I took AP Computer Science my senior year of high school, failed the AP exam, thought I would never do computer science ever again, and ended up in a biology lab where I couldn't get clearance to do wet lab work because I was under 18. So they put me in the bioinformatics department, and that's where I really learned to love coding and love artificial intelligence. I got to work with like clustering transcriptome data. And once I realized that computer science was something that I could use to understand the fundamentals of like what makes humans humans, particularly through neuroscience, I was absolutely hooked. And here I am now. So I'm so excited to see so many of you here. This has felt like somewhat of a niche subject for a while, and now I see 269 people here excited about this. At least I hope you're excited about it. So I'm going to hop into this talk about some research, a line of research that I've been working on for a couple of years now. Apologies to those of you who've seen this before in AI plus healthcare. I think I saw Parnita in here somewhere, so like she's an expert. You can ask her a few questions about these slides. I am also very open to interruptions. I love answering questions about my work as I go. And also, if you're confused, someone else probably is too. And the last thing I want to do is make it all the way through my slides and realize that everyone was caught on one particular word or phrase. And I definitely can't see the chat. So you can either like DM David to like get me to stop, or just come off mute, be brave, sing out Louise. Okay. So the topic of my presentation today is about invariant representations of facial emotion and identity. And invariants we'll go into more detail about later, but basically what an invariant representation is that no matter how many other things change about the thing that you're trying to understand, you can still recognize what it is. So you're looking at this cup of water in front of my face. I can bring it down. I can take a sip out of it. I can occlude part of it. But there's a lot of really interesting, complicated circuitry going on in your brain. That means no matter what I do to it, you recognize that this is a cup of water. So that's what invariance is. And we're going to talk about how the brain might, maybe do that for facial emotion and facial identity. And this was work I did at MIT and in collaboration with Boston College. Even though I graduated a couple of years ago, I still work with them because I love those labs. So if you have questions about doing undergrad research, also totally happy to answer that as well. Cool. So one of the cool things about your brain is that it's doing a lot of different things at the same time. So you are planning and coordinating motion. So I just made that little hand flourish to show you guys that I am planning lots of motions. You're identifying who people are. So you're looking at me and you're probably looking at my name tag and going, okay, that's Katie. You're parsing out individual object boundaries. So this is something that humans are particularly good at. You can see that this is where my face and body ends and the background begins. Maybe you're seeing that I'm wearing glasses, wearing headphones. These are things that you can do without even thinking about it, dividing the world into subdivided objects. You can predict others' behavior. So you have a model of how you think others might behave. So I'm probably not going to just stop talking for like a really awkward amount of time. That's not something consistent with how people behave during talks. You could be trying to determine other people's emotional states. So hopefully I am conveying excitement because I'm very excited to be here. but sometimes it's also kind of hard to tell what people are feeling. So this is something that's a little squishier, a little more difficult that's going on in your brain. Planning and producing speech. That is what I am doing right now. None of you are doing that unless you're doing so off mute, which I appreciate. Thank you. So a lot of these judgments are made based on an entirely overlapping set of inputs. So you're listening to me talk to you right now and you're going, okay, so is this sound speech? Yes. Do I recognize the speaker? Those of you who've had me as an instructor before might, but most of you don't. Is the speaker moving towards me, away from me? Unless you're listening in stereo and have like really good sound fidelity going on, that's probably something you can't actually tell from this kind of presentation. Are you expected to respond? Not right now. That's the beauty of a talk. You can just sit back and relax. How is the speaker feeling? As I have said many a time, I'm super hyped. Why are you still asking me? Why are you still trying to figure that out? I'm excited. Okay, so we're doing something similar with faces every time we see a face. So say we have this image over here. This is a woman named Sarah. That's not actually her name. I don't know her name because this data set is private. And I can look at her and I can say, okay, this is Sarah. I have lots of pictures of her and she is feeling happy. Now what we're doing with this is we're going, okay, I am recognizing this emotion of happy, and I'm also recognizing Sarah separately on her own. These are two pieces of information that we're pulling out of the same original data source. And emotion representation is an example of this concept of invariance that we talked about earlier. So you can look at all of these different faces. You can see that we have happy Sarah here. We can see that this young gentleman, even though he's turned his face to the side, you can still see that he's smiling, feeling happy. This is an older man. This is in black and white. This face is turned completely to the side, but it's still a relatively easy task for most of us to look at these pictures and say, aha, all these people are happy. So it's invariant to other visual features of the faces. And this is kind of cool because your brain does this really, really easily. It's very hard to do computationally. People who have been working on computer vision pipelines can attest to the fact that it is very difficult to build and maintain invariant representations. And one of the important questions about building invariant representations is what you do with extraneous information. And you could deal with this extra information, so this information about the fact that this face is Sarah's. If we're trying to figure out what her emotion is, we don't necessarily need that information. So say this extra information is a piece of paper. We could fold it up, throw it in the trash can, discard that extra information along the way. Or you could build this beautiful origami swan that we see on the right, and you could build representations of non-target information. You could carefully maintain that extra information and come to the conclusion that this is Sarah, in addition to recognizing that she's happy. Now, a question that you might be asking is, why? Why would you do that? Your brain is dealing with so much information. There's so many things that it's trying to optimize on at the same time. Why on earth would you maintain information that you don't necessarily need? Well, one thing that you could be doing is you could be using this recognition of who this person is to subtract away identity-dependent features. So maybe Sarah naturally has a relatively high distance between the top of her eyes and her eyebrows that makes her look naturally surprised. So if you know her well, you might see high eyebrows that would normally indicate surprise, but that could just be her resting face. You could know how wide her mouth normally is to determine whether or not she's smiling, non-flexed jaw width. So having this information about what people look like in their neutral state is useful for subtracting away identity-dependent information. This isn't just about pure physiology. This is also about behavioral patterns. So when I was younger, I had like braces, mouth gear, like the whole nerd thing going. So when I was particularly happy, I would kind of put my hand in front of my mouth when I was smiling or laughing because I didn't want people to lick my teeth. And for a couple of years after that, even when I had my mouth gear off, I would still put a hand in front of my face when I was smiling. So my friends very easily recognized that as like, oh, Katie's definitely laughing right now, which is something they might not have known if they hadn't had this identity dependent information. So let's talk about what might be happening if we discarded this information along the way. So what this would look like is we would take in this image of happy Sarah. You would see that we have these weak representations at the beginning. This representation of her emotional state would become stronger and stronger as you go through ventral and dorsal pathways in the brain. But this emotion representation would become weaker and weaker. And at the end, we would have no representation in the brain of this person's identity, but you'd have a strong representation of the emotion. On the other hand, if we were building representations of non-target information, we would start out with these weak representations early on in visual processing streams, and they would get stronger and stronger together until at the very end, we have a strong representation of the emotion and the identity. So the kind of state-of-the-art thought on this is that a lot of neuroscientists believe that this area called facial fusiform area is extracting away facial identity and throwing away the rest of the information. And that this separate region on a separate pathway, superior temporal sulcus, is getting this information on facial emotion and throwing away all the irrelevant information. So you have many different brain regions that are responsible for specific tasks and are abstracting away all this unnecessary information as they do so. However, there is some cool fMRI and lesion evidence that shows that superior temporal sulcus, the area that neuroscientists have been thinking only encoded information about emotion, also has information about identity. So if you are taking a functional magnetic resonance image of the brain as people look at faces, you can actually pretty reliably classify whose face they were looking at from patterns of blood flow to superior temporal sulcus, which was not supposed to be a thing that was possible. So this kind of weakens support for the trash bin model, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we build off-target representations. It could be that there was something going on with those specific faces that meant that you could pull out the identity just because you were using a specific kind of parcellation. Since I have 20 minutes, I'm not going to go into the hardcore neuroscience of how you parse out functional MRI data. I'm just going to say it's complicated. It's fun. Come help us with this. It's a hard task. So what my professors and I decided to do is that we wanted to see if we could build a proof of concept neural network model to see if we trained a convolutional neural network based somewhat on the structure of human visual processing pipelines. Did they turn out to look more like the trash bin model that was throwing away irrelevant information, or the origami model that was building these off-target representations? So to take a step back, I'm going to remind you guys what we can train a neural network to do, and that is take in this face right here, do some fun matrix math, and pop out a representation of this facial emotion. Some of you guys might have actually done this as a project in deep dives before. I've taught that one a couple times before. And you can get relatively high accuracy, somewhere around 65%, which for those of you thinking that that sounds low, that is actually human performance. We're worse at this task than we think we are, which is a whole nother side tangent. Why do we think we're so much better at emotion recognition than we are? And we can talk more about that later if we want. So if we had the trash can model going on in our neural network, what it would look like is that if we trained our neural network to get this emotion representation at the end, if we added linear layers for decoding at each of these different layers of the network, we would start out with weak representations of both identity and emotion. The emotion representations would grow stronger, and the identity representations would grow weaker. Meanwhile, if we had the origami model that showed up in our network, both of these representations would grow stronger. So, okay, this is what the theoretical predictions are. What do the results actually look like? Little drum roll, drum roll, drum roll, drum roll. Well, I don't know yet. We have to train the net first. So what we did is we used a densely connected convolutional neural network trained on an FER 2013 data set. So you can see the data set over here is a bunch of faces in black and white, very small 48 by 48 pixel images of people displaying these 7 different emotions. So they could be neutral, afraid, disgusted, surprised, angry, sad, or happy. And then what we had in our network is we had an initial convolutional layer, and then we had these 3 dense blocks, which each consisted of 3 convolutional layers. The thing that was interesting about these is that in a normal neural network, you have connections that go forward layer by layer, but you don't necessarily have connections between the first layer and the last layer. Information does get transmitted backwards via backpropagation, but it gets back to early layers much more slowly. There's something called the vanishing gradient problem, where sometimes error propagation backwards dissolves away before it sends information all the way back. But we wanted this to resemble the human brain as much as possible. And one of my favorite brain fun facts that is oversimplified, like this is not always true, but most 2 neurons can be connected to each other within a distance of about 3 other neurons between them. Like the brain is intensely self-connected. So we wanted each of our dense layers to be densely connected to each other. And we have 3 large chunks that look like this. So now we want to check the representational robustness at various parts of the net. Because remember, the thing that differentiates these 2 models is how strong this identity representation is at the end. So what we're going to do to measure representational robustness is the first thing that we'll do is that we'll freeze various parts of the net. So these convolutional through dense 3 layers cannot be changed anymore. And then we'll remove this last linear layer and keep this one frozen. So, okay, what we do is we get rid of these last dense layers. And then what we can do is we can say, okay, once we put this information through our convolutional neural network, we ignore these 3, and then we get the representation at the end. We could go maybe through the first 2 and see how well the classification works, go through the first 3, but not the last part, and see how well it does. And with the general structure of how neural networks work, what we would expect is that this representational robustness, aka the accuracy with which it classifies these emotions, gets stronger and stronger, more accurate and more accurate over time. Now, that's how we test for representational robustness of emotion detection. And that's somewhat easier because emotion detection is the thing that we trained this net for in the first place. Like, all we gave it was a bunch of faces and emotion labels. So now what we're going to want to do is test how much information this network that has never been given any explicit information about identity as a concept, as a category, like this network doesn't know what identity is. We want to see, nevertheless, how well we can decode identity from the representations that have built up in this network. So what we might do is we might freeze all of these layers and then attach a new linear layer to the end that instead of having 7 emotions, now has 70 identities. There are 70 different identities in a data set that we used to test this out. So what we can see is that over the course of the network, as we expected, the accuracy of emotion classification gets better as we go, tops out at about 75%. And so far, these results are like, cool, our network does what we want it to do. This is not terribly surprising. But now let's see what happened for identity. And this is the really, really, really cool thing. This neural network that was trained entirely on facial emotion, knows nothing about what identity even is, by this very last layer, was hitting very nearly 100% accuracy on classifying facial identity. It could look at a face, and with the information that it had pulled out of those faces, just to know things about emotion, tell you with 99% accuracy who that person was. One thing that's also really cool is that you can see that there's this big jump in representational robustness between this first dense block and the second dense block in both emotion and identity, which means not only is identity getting stronger, But identity as a representation is also getting stronger, somewhat in line, like in a correlated way with emotion, which gives us some preliminary evidence that the information that we're building up about emotion is also useful for being able to decode identity. So what we see here is that the origami model in our convolutional neural network spontaneously arises. So what happens next? Neural nets are definitely not brains. One thing that an undergrad in the lab that I worked on this project in is now working on as a follow-up is whether we can use this model to predict representations like actually in the brain. So they're collecting some fMRI data now. My PI is also interested, when I say PI, I mean principal investigator. I'm not working with a private investigator. I realize that that is kind of a science-specific term. But my PI, the professors that I work with, wanted to know, okay, what other features were built up? Maybe it's something less personal than identity, like do we also maintain like facial rotation information? What else can we extract here? One thing that's important about superior temporal sulcus as a region is that it also encodes biological motion, so motion that is consistent with what a biological organism would do. So we're super curious to see like what motion information does in this context. And one thing that's also kind of important is like, okay, so does this just tell us things about superior temporal sulcus? Could it predict behavior for facial fusiform area too? What happens if we train this neural network on identity, then try to extend it to emotion? So if we do the opposite of what I did, and this isn't published yet, but I can give you a little like spoiler alert that the other people who've been working on this since then have found that the same thing works in the other direction. So yeah, we have learned things about the brain, face processing, the fact that artificial intelligence is not just for tech. Like I have worked in tech for one summer, absolutely hated it. Like, don't get me wrong, love the free food and perks and beanbags and stuff, but I much prefer to be doing science. And that is a totally valid way to do AI, and it's a lot of fun. Cool. Do you guys have any questions?